today you had an incredible amount of speakers. You got some insane tips and frameworks to push through. So I wanted to make sure I set the expectations that I'm not going to give you any tips here, right? I'm really going to be posing a question to our industry. And so hopefully after this, you're going to have some drinks and maybe it sparks some conversation around it. And that's really the goal of this entire presentation. So first off, what in the world are we even talking about? All right. What is Web3, right? So I think it's first best to, I've learned I have to point at this. Let's first define, what Web 1, 2, and 3 is, right? So Web 1 really started, I'd say, 1991 through 2004. And it's the web I grew up, and maybe some of you, and maybe not a lot of you, but that web was very static. We'd go to the internet and consume information only. We didn't interact with it. It's the days of Yahoo directories and stuff like that, right? Literally static websites. And that really started changing post 2004 and so forth, right? But that literally was the web I grew up in. And certainly the web that we are sitting in right now is called Web 2. Oops. Web 2 is essentially the user-generated web, right? It's what we've been talking about all day. It's about social platforms. It's about an ability for you to interact with the content and essentially create the majority of the content that actually exists on the internet. That's not how it was in Web 1. That's the fundamental difference, right? The acceleration of social platforms, the acceleration of things like LinkedIn or Yelp for reviews and so forth, or G2 from the B2B side of things of reviews, or Glassdoor. Those are all examples of really the evolution of Web 2, and that's the world we largely live in, okay? So it's all good, it's a good world, but there's some flaws in that world, right? Some great things, some bad things, and that's really what Web 3 is trying to push through. So in essence, you can probably Google, and there's a lot of big definitions on what Web 3 is, and there's actually some historical definitions and so forth, but really the consensus is really it's a big evolutionary leap forward in the internet. But exactly what the hell does that mean, right? So I'm going to kind of read this out real fast, right? So the main principle here is that it will be a decentralized rather than controlled by governments or corporations, as is the case in today's internet, right? So what I'll explain decentralization a bit more, but I want to kind of key in on a couple of things, right? So today, when we access the internet, we access the internet through servers, right? And data centers with AWS or with Google Cloud or whatever it is. Those are all owned by corporations, right? The other aspect of this is that it may not feel it, but those are somewhat regulated by the government, right? In the type of content we have, in what we can do, what we can say, either by the government or by corporations. And you may be coming out of this discussion saying, I don't know if I really want to go into Web3, or yes, Web3 is all the way, right? Because the concept is really breaking that control, if you will, whether it's corporation or decentralization of government, right? I don't know where I stand in this either, right? There's some pros and cons that you'll explore throughout, okay? So we have to keep in mind essentially that Web3 is essentially still forming in front of us, right? And there's elements, some people will say the Metaverse is Web3, right? And I'll explain, that's really an element of what Web3 is. It's greater than that. Bitcoin is Web3. Yes, it is, actually. It's one tiny, tiny component of it. There's new social platforms that are coming out that are based on Web3 technology, blockchain technology. That's again a tiny component of it. There's so many components of it. So let's dive in a bit more, right? So the topic is how Web3 can influence things like reviews and testimonials. And Why am I even talking about reviews and testimonials? Well, reviews and testimonials is just maybe one example of where in the Web 2 world, our world today, it's extremely helpful, but it's also extremely unauthentic. Alicia talked about authenticity, and I think a couple other presenters talked about that, right? That's a super important aspect of things. But there's an incredible amount of junk out there. Our Web 2 world is full of crap, a lot of crap, and it's trying to filter through that. And essentially, Web 3 has a promise of getting rid of some of that crap. Whether it can or not, or perhaps it even makes it worse, I'm not too sure, right? But I'll kind of explain why there's a problem, and then, we'll dive into really where, Web 3 could take a place in it. So, reviews and testimonials in the Web 2 world. Now, who uses reviews? Everyone uses reviews. I mean, there shouldn't be a hand that doesn't come up, right? I use reviews, everyone uses reviews, right? So what's interesting here is the amount of reviews that exist. I think I rattled off a few places like, G2 or Glassdoor or Yelp or Airbnb or you name it, right? Let's just take Amazon, right? Amazon has over 250 million reviews, right? That's an incredible amount of reviews, right? I'd imagine that we all kind of peek at reviews, and that makes, an impact or an impression on our buying decision, right? It advocates for one brand over the other, a Airbnb place that I want to stay in versus another one, right? It's a heavy influence on where we make purchase decisions, service decisions, where we take vacations, all those things. It's a huge component of our entire industry. And as marketers, reviews can be our friends or can be our enemies, right? Bad reviews and changing that influence can be very daunting, right? Good reviews and so forth can also be an area where we can double down on, essentially, right? Oops. Now, 82% of adults check reviews. No big surprise, all good, right? Interestingly enough, only 3 to 10% of us actually write reviews on a consistent basis, right? So that's interesting. So there's tons of reviews, right? And we all rely on reviews to make decisions in the buyer's journey and whatever, right? Yet only a fraction of us actually write reviews. So it's interesting. There we go. 61% of reviews are deemed fake. And I don't think this is a surprising stat to everyone, right? But the question is, which ones are actually fake and which ones are real, right? Sometimes it's really, really hard to tell. And then sometimes it's super obvious, right? So let's quickly look at that. So on the left, I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's some good reviews for, these earbuds, right, on Amazon, right? And, you can read through these. These are really good. Like, it's really hard for me to tell. Can anyone tell which one is a fake one and which one's real? Anyone? It's really hard, right? Because they all sound different, right? On the right-hand side, it's a little bit easier, right? This is for an apartment in London, okay? Now, Leo and Stephanie seem to have the exact same experience with the exact same words, right? Obviously, that's fake, right? And I can tell that it's fake because there's 2 5-stars, but the real ones are these 1-stars over here that's saying that this place is a piece of shit, right? These two are fake, and that's easy to tell, but it's really hard for me to tell on that. The only assumption I can make is that if these earbuds have only 5-star reviews, I'm probably going to say, yeah, I don't know about that, right? There should be some 4 stars, some 3 stars, and so forth. So innately, it's really hard for us as consumers to even understand what's real and what's fake, right? Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. Why? Because the Web 2 world allows that to happen. There's no easy governance of that. So My thesis is basically that Web 2 is not authentic. I'm not saying everything isn't, but in general, the world we live in and the internet we live in today is essentially has a large element of fake. And if you go back to that stat, 82% of us use reviews to make buying decisions, but yet 61% of those buying those reviews essentially fake. So we're getting influenced one way or the other, right? A couple of interesting things. So you guys familiar with black hat companies? Black hat companies basically pay people to write reviews, right? People make a lot of money out of this. Some people make up to $10,000 a month. It's a real freaking job, just writing fake reviews, right? In and out, but that's existing. Very much so. Everyone's like, how do I get that job? Right? Automated bots, right, generate millions of reviews. In fact, that example I showed you on the right is likely an automated bot, not a very sophisticated automated bot because it used the exact same language. Okay. Oh, hell, did I step on something? Ah. Nope. It wants cocktails. It's like, I've had enough. I'll stand here on this side. No? Sorry, everyone. It's okay. Whilst they're fixing it, I'll talk to the rest, right? So my point being, oh, great. I'll stand on this side just in case. My point being is that, essentially, reviews can be manipulated, right? And certainly manipulated by algorithms. I'm not just talking about bots and so forth, but also by corporations, right? By governments. Corporations who have full control can put things higher than the others. They can edit them. They can manipulate them. They can give you a story that they want to tell you, whether you like it or not. And you don't know the difference on that. But that's the internet of today. That is Web 2, essentially. So real reviews can be edited, blah, blah, blah. I think I just mentioned that. And then the last thing is that, interestingly enough, the end user who puts a review out, once they put it on a site, we don't own that. That's now owned by the corporation. Who's ever tried to go in and change a review once they've put it on? You can't do it, right? And it's then used in any other fashion. You don't own it. It's now owned by whoever, Yelp, G2, Glassdoor, blah, 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 name your thing. It's a good thing and a bad thing, maybe, but you're the one who put it out there, but you don't actually have any ownership rights to it, okay? So how could Web3 affect review data? And again, I'm talking about a subset, right? I'm just talking about review data here, but Web3 is much bigger than that. I'm just giving an indication of how it can affect our lives. So first off, I talked about this concept of decentralized web, right? And I kind of want to expand on exactly what that means. So you have a firm understanding of what Web3 represents from a decentralization standpoint. So again, as I said at the beginning, most of the infrastructure is accessed through websites or data that's controlled by corporations and controlled by governments. And there's regulations. It's not like it's unregulated, and every country is kind of different. And in fact, in the US, every state's different. And then when you start thinking about GDPR and so forth, it gets even more and more and more, right? So it's actually fairly regulated, right? In a good way sometimes, and sometimes maybe not in a good way. So blockchain, now hopefully everyone's heard of blockchain at some extent. You may not understand blockchain, but it's okay. But blockchain is really what spearheaded really the beginnings of Web3, I'd say, right? And blockchain is really the way we store data online. That's essentially it. And there's really two principles to that. One is encryption, right, which I'll go into in 2 seconds. And the other is distributed computing, right? So encryption, what it essentially does with encryption is that It stores data within the blockchain, and it can only be accessed by the person who created it or who has control over it, right? So in my example of if you created a review, you would actually have control over it, right? Not where it lives, but you're the originator, so you have control, or whoever you give control, right? That's a huge principle. That data can live on a corporate server, on a government server, on a private server, on whatever, right? But it still has an originator, the owner, or whoever that owner gives. And I'll always own that. The other concept here is distributed computing, right? Which is that data is shared across many different computers, right? What's interesting about blockchain is that essentially it's spread across not only servers within corporations and maybe in AWS and maybe on someone's laptop in Finland or whatever it may be, right? Or gaming server, right? The point is that it's shared across, and if one of those files is not the same as the other, it's not valid. So there's no way, it's really hard to manipulate data in blockchain, right? It's considered actually, almost unhackable. I say almost because there's always a way, right? But it's one of the truest methods of actually having data that it's really hard to manipulate and change. So, you're seeing like currencies like crypto and so forth using these technologies. You're seeing a lot of organizations, I was speaking to someone on my table who's in marketing with agricultural companies, right? They're using blockchain to authenticate where a certain dairy product came from, right? And you can't manipulate that supply chain. So it's happening everywhere. So that's the concept there, essentially, right? The other element here is that it's trustless, right? Interactions and transactions taking place between basically two parties don't have to have a third-party trusted element, right? So Bitcoin's a great example. I can exchange Bitcoin, right, with someone else. I don't need a trusted third party, aka a bank, right? So that's the concept. But think about it further with reviews in this case and what I'm talking about, but then take it further with, say, social platforms that are built on this instead, right? Applications and so forth, right? The other element is that it's permissionless, right? Neither party in a transaction or an interaction have to seek permission from a third party. That's a huge concept, right? Now, that can also be a big negative because you can get some pretty crazy shit out there, right? But that's also the concept of, free speech in a sense. Again, like you can be for some of these things and against some of these things, and is there a middle ground? There possibly is a middle ground, right? But that's the concept of the next generation of the internet that we will face. It's already happening. So the types of impacts we should think about, and I promise we're going to go through this fast so we can get to drinks earlier, okay? So the principle of Web3, certainly has a direct influence on the authenticity of data itself, right? And as a result, things like reviews and testimonials. And I'm using such a blasé example here, right? Because Web3 is more than that. But if you just apply that to everything we just talked about, if I can actually have authenticity in knowing that that review is real, it's not a bot or something like that, I can trace it back, right? All those aspects of things. It can have a huge measurable impact in consumer trust and the buying decision, right? So I certainly think we're a long way away from that, but there's technology already building into this, right? So we need to start thinking as marketers how that could change, and influence our pre-sale, post-sale engagement marketing activities, right? it's still early days, as I said, right? But our world as marketers will change. That's inevitable. And it's basically how we see it play out and how we react to it that'll kind of forge our entire industry over the next decade. So the other element here is AI. And, I don't want to, so AI and machine learning, two different things, right? AI, I'm going to talk about very, very briefly, more so that it's possibly the most critical component to actually allowing Web3 to actually function, right? There'll be a heavy heavy need for machine-to-machine communication and decision-making, real-time decision-making. They'll be needed certainly for Web3 applications. And there's a good amount of Web3 applications out there already. You may not know them, or sometimes you may be interacting with them. There's actually Web3 applications already up and running already, right? So what that really allows us is to basically, detect fakes a lot easier, but it also changes the landscape of marketing a little bit. Marketing will need to move into more automation in its core principles, in its core usage, right? As a primary mechanism for Web3, just at the pace it will move at, right? So I think we've seen that certainly in the last 10, 15 years, you've seen marketing automation take a much larger role in marketing, right? 20 years ago, didn't really exist. 15 years ago, 10 years ago, everyone's talking about it. 5 years ago, you better be doing it. Now, it's mainstream, right? In 10 years, it'll be the prominent way of actually marketing. So the Metaverse, there's a lot of noise around this. Metaverse, I think in the simplest way to think about this is the user interface to Web3, right? It's essentially how we interact, right? Obviously, you've seen Facebook rebrand to Meta. They're betting on a new user interface of the new internet, right? Our user interface today is Chrome, Safari, all those kind of things, right? The new interface into the new internet is essentially, aka the Metaverse. It's just basically the UI. Think of it as a user interface to that. But what does that mean, right? You're seeing the Metaverse incorporate things like VR and AR and everything else. So if you think about how that plays into the next internet, how does that change those interactions, right? Yeah, again, I'm going back to my simple example of reviews, right? The reviews and testimonials and the way we see it on Yelp or Airbnb are going to be completely different. What is that? How are you going to influence that, right? Those are the changes in front of us. I'm hoping actually it's more authentic, just to Alicia's point, like that is good marketing. When it's authentic and real, that's good marketing. So, it's unclear how marketers will have to change, as I said, right? It's an interesting, just even I'm forgetting the guy who talks about TikTok. His name is fantastic presentation. Thank you. But like how influencing marketing change. I mean, he kind of mentioned that it may get pushed away by the brands, but maybe it won't. I don't know, right? But I do think Web3 will play a huge element in influencing marketing, right? What does authentic marketing actually look like, right? Today, if anything, I'm saying that Web2, the world we're in, is not authentic, right? Us as marketers are trying to stand out by being authentic in places and actually engage with consumers and have a value proposition or shared value with them, right? So, is our next evolution really to try and be the authentic marketing of the next era, right? I don't know. And then last but not least, who will influence the brand, right? And that's changing quite a bit, right? Think about the pandemic, right? Think about, social movements, Me Too, gun control, Roe v. Wade, and so forth, right? The B2B world is already having to engage in making a stance in that, right? For the B2B marketers out there, we're way behind the ballpark on that. B2B brands have been forced by their consumers to make a stance one way or the other. B2B brands have been kind of sitting silent. That's an issue. At some point, we're going to be forced, consumers will force brands down a path, right? So it's interesting. Is the brand really controlling what the brand is, the corporation that is, or is the consumer going to influence that? And how does authenticity and the ability to own those elements, own your data, have full transparency, know that it can never go away. It's not controlled by a corporation, not controlled by a government. It's filtered through to have real stuff and taking away the stuff, right? So it's a brave new world that we're really at the beginnings of. And hopefully that gives you a bit more of conversation as you go into cocktails and all that kind of good stuff. I know a little early. I'm certainly open to questions. If I can go to there's my question slide. I'm happy to take any questions, or Russ can, I'm sure, usher us into a wrap up. Anything with the the box thing?
I've actually got a question if no one else does. Anyway, any questions? You guys are just hanging for a drink, aren't you?
They want a drink.
Okay. My question around Web3, and you'll have to excuse me, I've got zero idea. So I might be voicing something that other people have got. How does that affect Web 2? Like if things are moving to Web 3, like the Web 2, and is this like, does one become extinct, the other one's no longer around? Do they merge? What's the roadmap to this future?
Yeah, so I think they merge in a sense, right? That there's a lot of interesting. Jack Dorsey, the former CEO of Twitter, his opinion on Web3 as an example is that you think it's going to be the free internet, essentially. That's Web3 is the free internet, right? From a utopian standpoint, right? But he would contest that the companies funding Web3 applications and Web3 environments and so forth are really the VCs and the LPs, right? So his argument is that, yeah, that utopia that you all think and you're all kind of going for is really going to just be controlled anyway. So it's really Web 2, right? So I personally think that you're going to see a crop of applications truly open, right? As in distributed, uncontrolled by governments, uncontrolled by corporations, and so forth. And I think it's going to be too far. And I think corporations will still have their voice and their applications, and you'll start merging some of the technology together to find some middle ground. I think there's a middle ground out there. I think the problem with the movement of Web3 is that it's all this or nothing, right? And a lot of our social issues is all this or nothing, right? And there's always a middle ground. That helps.
We've got another question over there. Where's the orange box?
I don't have the orange.
Thanks, Andrew.
You mentioned that the Metaverse is sort of a feature of Web3 because it makes just more face-to-face interaction and everything. But if the Metaverse is owned by a corporation like Facebook, then isn't that really like pretty Web 2?
Yes and no, right? So the Metaverse, so real fast again, the Metaverse, just think of it literally as the user interface into it, right? Much like Chrome is, right? So you may be accessing things through the Metaverse, but that data itself is not controlled by the corporation, right? The information and so forth. So the concept really behind Web3 is really the decentralization of ownership, right? It's not owned by a corporation or a government. It's not regulated by that, right? And I can't delete it. I can't manipulate it, and so forth. So yes, you may be using Facebook Meta, right, to access that, but Facebook Meta can't change that. They can't change that information. They don't have the right to. They can interface with it, but they can't change it. So that's the fundamental difference.
One last question. Oh, no, one more here, and I've got another one. Thank you.
Okay. My question is, how will Web3 affect service-based companies that are online or strictly online? As you can say, for example, Shopify or, well, really anything that sells an online service.
Yeah. I mean, I think still corporations will exist in those forms, right? You know, as I said, it's like we're super early, right, in this. But I do think if consumers start demanding, you know, ownership and so forth, or transparency, which I'd argue that most of us would argue that we want transparency in the information that we're accessing, right? Then I do think that the Shopifys and so forth, retailers and so forth, those are still very much exist, but perhaps how they share, like going back to reviews, how they actually share the reviews through a separate Web3 application that's using authentic data, as opposed to controlled by Shopify's platform where all that is on there, or Amazon, or pick your whatever. Yeah.
Another question here. Thank you. Can we throw that? Yeah. Whoa.
Oh, nice
Yes,
one.
good catch.
Very good.
Great throw.
Love it.
Maybe just to help clarify a little bit here.
Yeah.
It's the data custody chain of both the infrastructure that the web runs on and also the user experience. So blockchain, there will still be companies.
Oh, yeah.
They will still function, and you'll still be able to participate in Meta, the Facebook version of the Metaverse. But then you can also choose to go outside of it and say Amazon couldn't block your content because AWS. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's actually a very complex chain that they're trying to simplify, so your data is separate from the service providers that move it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's the core principle is basically the freedom of the data and the ownership of the data, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Why would Facebook do that?
Facebook.
Like, why would they decide to not own
Well,
the
I
data?
think Facebook is trying to go and own it, right? So let's be real with what Facebook's really trying to do.
No, I know.
Yeah,
okay,
so
why would
you're
Meta
saying why
decide
would
not to?
he's basically saying why would Facebook
they agree
or
to that?
Meta, the interface, allow you to access the data that they don't own and control,
Yeah.
right? Because I think other companies are already coming up and consumers will shift to them.
Yeah, they'll lose users.
So eventually they will. I mean, listen, Facebook is already losing massive ground, right? Huge ground. So they already know that they need to shift away from Facebook to new platforms, new interfaces, new mechanisms. You know, so they're really preparing for Web3, if you think about it, right? They don't want to go down that route. Of course not. Google doesn't want to go down the route of losing control of search and you know, all those things and everything else. But all I'm saying is that this is coming. It's like a freight train you can't stop. The problem is we don't know what the damn freight train looks like, right? Or even how to control the freight train. But it's coming. It's not a if, it's coming.